with the fact that alchemy from its beginnings has been both a theoretical and a practical science, with an element always of laboratory work. Alchemists have always been messing around with things in furnaces and distilling things and roasting, just taking what they find and seeing, does it combine with other things? What happens when I take table salt and stick it over a campfire for long enough and collect the distillate? And it makes this extraordinary acid which burns my fingers and stings my nostrils, and it's hydrochloric acid, right?
The Philosopher's Stone, the source of infinite wealth and everlasting life. It can turn everyday metals into gold and create the elixir of immortality. It's one of the most famous myths in the world. But for centuries, it wasn't a myth. Some of the greatest and most pioneering scientists in history believed in the power of the stone and pursued its riches. Amongst them was Sir Isaac Newton. As is depicted in the audio drama Assassin's Creed Gold, there is another fascinating aspect to the renowned scientist's life: his research into alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone. Just how far did Isaac Newton take his alchemical experiments? What did the Philosopher's Stone mean to a rational scientist of Newton's standing? And why was his research into alchemy only recently brought to life, even though he wrote over 1 million words about it in his personal notes? Thank you very much for joining us on Echoes of History, Joel. It's great to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be here, Matt. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very much looking forward to finding out more about alchemy and Isaac Newton and stuff like that. But I wanted to get into a bit more of the more ancient history of alchemy before we get closer to Isaac Newton. And I think lots of people listening will be familiar with the concept, the idea of the Philosopher's Stone. And this is an item that can be created, and it combines two things that I think human beings have probably always been interested in: the idea of turning base things into gold, so increasing their value. We see that, King Midas and stuff like that in the Bible, this idea that turning things into gold is possible. And then you marry that with the idea of an elixir of life that grants you immortality, if you like, and it crops up in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written like 4,000 years ago. So again, something else that humans have always been interested in. But do we have an idea of when those two things kind of become joined together in a single item of the Philosopher's Stone? How far back in history does the idea of the Philosopher's Stone go?
The idea of the Philosopher's Stone, it crops up, in bits and pieces here and there. But the general idea of an alchemical Philosopher's Stone that can transmute base metals into gold and perhaps also act as something of a universal medicine or an elixir of life, it's really in the Arabic Middle Ages, after Greek alchemy has passed to individuals like Jabir ibn Hayyan and others in that period. And then alchemy's real heyday follows in the early modern era and the Renaissance, when there's just an explosion of interest in making the Philosopher's Stone and writing books about it and all the other things that go along with alchemical pursuits.
Is it right the Philosopher's Stone is in contrast to King Midas? So King Midas is sort of a curse in that everything he touches turns to gold, but the stone only seeks to turn kind of base metals into gold, so transforming less valuable metals into something that's more valuable. Is that right?
Generally, that's right, yeah. It's the idea of taking base metals like lead or tin and turning them into gold, sometimes also silver. Generally, the Philosopher's Stone is thought to be some kind of a powder that you could mix in with various processes and hopefully make some kind of gold. Some people do believe that the Philosopher's Stone will grant you extraordinarily long life, but in the Western tradition of alchemy, most people do not believe that it will give you eternal life. There are some ideas in Chinese alchemy, which is a very different tradition. This dates back to the ancient world. There are ideas of an elixir of life which can grant immortality, and many people died drinking an elixir of life containing horrible things and heavy metals and what have you. But yeah, the Western tradition is different, and the idea is the Philosopher's Stone would act as a universal medicine. It would heal from all diseases or act as a universal medicine, a universal purgative in some instances. But also there's a lot of disagreement about what the Philosopher's Stone actually does.
It's interesting because I think it feels slightly incongruous that we have this alchemical powder, stone, whatever it really is, that does those two things, that turns base metal into gold, but also heals people. And the elixir of life, I think, is quite often, it's suggested that that's sort of a form of liquid gold. But is there any kind of alchemical logic to why those two things are married together in one item, why those two properties might come together?
Yeah, the answer is going to be different for different individuals. So, here at the Huntingdon Library, we have a famous medieval document called the Ripley Scroll, which is a 10.5-foot long scroll, highly illustrated. It has an allegorical representation of the making of the Philosopher's Stone, and it portrays individuals like Hermes Trismegistus, and so that's thrice great Hermes, the alleged father of alchemy. Various other individuals doing all sorts of different metaphorical things, but also some literal things, dumping flasks into large pools, but you have also, dragons bleeding from their belly, and a rich allegory which is supposed to represent the making of the Philosopher's Stone. And in that document, it's also thought to be an elixir of life, but exactly how they're connected, the Philosopher's Stone, the idea is you can make gold. And as you noted, other elixirs of life are often things that contain gold. So aurum potabile, potable gold, which is another substance that comes up in the alchemical tradition. That's thought to be an elixir. An elixir is a word that can mean many, many different things. Some people have an elixir that they think will dissolve everything. Others have an elixir of life, elixir vitae. There are many different ideas about the connections between those two things.
The Ripley Scroll, it's on the Huntingdon website, isn't it? If you go to huntingdon.org, you can find a copy of it there. And I've had a look, and it's a stunning piece of work. And is that positioned as some kind of instructional manual for how to create the Philosopher's Stone? Did someone believe that if you followed those steps, if you could decipher that, then you would be able to make it? Is this like a recipe?
It is something of a recipe, yes. So alchemy in the early modern era especially, it's hidden in code. You would, if you were an alchemist and you had the secret of the Philosopher's Stone, you would conceal that in a code. Sometimes we use the German term Decknamen, cover names. And gold is often represented as a sun, silver as a moon, and things like that. So there are symbols which can conceal meaning. But there's also much, much deeper and richer symbols and allegories. In the Ripley Scroll, you have a bird of Hermes. You have also the dragon, which bleeds from its belly. You have the green lion, all of these different things which are supposed to conceal what the alchemist is actually doing in a laboratory. And there are many, many other representations of this. There's another famous alchemist named Basilius Valentinus, or Basil Valentine, who has different keys of alchemy, and he conceals his meaning. But the idea is also to reveal your meaning to the adept, to those who are worthy. Alchemy is often thought of as higher knowledge, which could be concealed from certain people and then revealed to others.
It's ringing bells for me in that for a brief moment, I was slightly obsessed with the Voynich manuscript. I don't know if you know about that, but I'm starting to wonder whether, nobody's ever been able to crack the code of that. Is that something similar? Could that be an alchemist's book in which they've hidden symbols so well that nobody has ever been able to decipher it ever since. It's fascinating to think that they're working in code.
Yeah, the Voynich code is something that I believe still has not been cracked. Parts of the Alchemical Code have been cracked, for instance, by historians today. So I've worked on a project since I was in graduate school called The Chemistry of Isaac Newton. And the benefit of alchemy is that many people throughout history were interested in alchemy, such as Isaac Newton, and he tried to reveal the secrets of alchemy in the laboratory. So we do have various descriptions of people who are going through something like the Ripley Scroll or the writings of George Ripley or Basil Valentine or other alchemists, and they're actually either in a laboratory taking notes on what they're doing or simply trying to decode stuff like the green lion and saying that that's actually antimony, or these other coded chemical secrets are particular chemical elements or compounds in the lab. And so one of my favorites comes from a Newton manuscript. Newton is trying to understand the secret of this substance called the star regulus of antimony. And Basil Valentine has a description of this star regulus. Also, one of Newton's favorite alchemists, an individual named Irenaeus Philalethes, which is a pseudonym for a Bermuda-born individual named George Starkey. So Philalethes has a description of this star regulus of antimony, but it's in highly coded language, and he's talking about the menstrual blood of the sordid whore and doves of Diana, friends of Cadmus. It's this really wild description. And going through that, it's pretty clear, both from Newton's attempts to decipher this and from others, to make a star regulus of antimony, you start with the sordid whore, which is the ore form of antimony, which is stibnite, antimony trisulfide. And you add some iron and you stick it in a furnace, and then it yields reduced antimony, so pure antimony metal. You allow that to cool under its slag, and it reveals this crystalline surface of antimony, which kind of sparkles. And so when I was working on the chemistry of Isaac Newton, working with Professor Bill Newman at Indiana University, we did some of this in a laboratory, and we had a furnace, and we made a star regulus, and it did indeed sparkle.
And so to bring us back to the late 17th century and to Assassin's Creed. So Assassin's Creed Gold, the novel, takes place in London in 1696. And this is when Isaac Newton has just been appointed as Warden of the Royal Mint. So we talked about his work as Warden of the Royal Mint in a previous episode. And alchemy also cropped up then, because someone who's interested in money is necessarily going to be interested in gold too. In 1936, some of Isaac Newton's personal papers were sold at an auction, and this included a bunch of his notes on alchemy. There was one text, I think, called On the Preparation of Mercury for the Stone by Means of the Stellate Regulus of Mars and Luna, which comes from George Starkey, who you mentioned earlier. Was that auction the first time that people really became aware of Isaac Newton's connection to alchemy? And what can we learn from those papers that were uncovered in 1936 about Newton's own alchemical research? How interested was he really in alchemy?
Newton's alchemy is endlessly fascinating, but it has also been a controversial subject over the years. So Newton didn't really publish on alchemy, and it was a controversial subject in his lifetime, even though it was, transmutation was technically legalized in his lifetime. But it did remain controversial. He didn't really publish on it. Much like his theological works, most of them remained in manuscript form. And there's a reason his biography by Richard Westphal was called Never at Rest. He was truly always working. So whether co-inventing calculus or theorizing gravity or doing optical experiments, he was also heavily invested in alchemy over the course of his lifetime. worked with assistants in laboratories to pursue alchemical ideas. And yeah, it really wasn't until that Sotheby's sale in 1936 the full scope of Newton's alchemy came into view. And it was famously John Maynard Keynes who had said, Newton was not the first of the age of reason, he was the last of the magicians. Which is a very particular take on alchemy at that time, when alchemy was thought to be magic and the domain of strictly charlatans and people who were seeking to deceive others. So very fortunately, certain individuals who were at that auction purchased Newton's alchemical manuscripts, thinking that they had some kind of value. One individual who purchased quite a few of those was a guy named Roger Babson. Babson is the founder of Babson College, which is just outside of Boston. He was an investor and an entrepreneur. At one point, he had an unsuccessful bid for the presidency in the U.S. He's a really fascinating guy. And his theory of investing and his theory of really how everything in the world works was based on Newton's third law, that everything has every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So his autobiography was titled Actions and Reactions. Because of this, he was obsessed with Newton. He collected Newton manuscripts, Newton books. He even went so far as to buy Newton's four-parlor of his last residence in London. And he brought the wall panels and the windows and the sconces and I think the fireplace to Babson College. It's now a wonderful conference room there. Babson collected Newton manuscripts. Those went to a place called the Dibner Institute, which was founded by an individual named Byrne Dibner. And then eventually that whole collection came to the Huntingdon. So it's one of the largest collections of Newtoniana in the world. It's about 4 manuscripts, many of them in Newton's own hand. Thousands of books, about 14 books, which are from Newton's library. Some of them have dog ears of Newton himself, and they span his theological ideas and also his alchemical ideas. So Newton's theological ideas were also highly controversial. He was an anti-Trinitarian, which is a heretical position to take in 17th and early 18th centuries. We have a major manuscript at the Huntingdon which contains Newton's drawings of Solomon's temple and also some of his anti-Trinitarian ideas, something that remained in manuscript. So yeah, Newton left most of his alchemical ideas, pretty much all of his alchemical ideas, in manuscript form. He didn't publish them. They weren't ever seen by a large readership, really until today. So yeah, I worked on the Chemistry of Isaac Newton, which is a project to take all of Newton's manuscripts and put them up online. It's led by Bill Newman at Indiana University, and many other individuals have worked on this project. And it's only been through projects like that that the really full spectrum of Newton's alchemy has been revealed. And we now have a much better idea of what he was doing. Much like his other pursuits, Newton was searching for secrets of nature. He was trying to reveal orderly laws of nature in matter. As Bill Newman puts it, he was searching for nature's secret fire. But it also reveals many things about Newton that we see in his other pursuits. When Isaac Newton was asked what he thought was special about him, what made him different from other people, and why he had made so many extraordinary discoveries, he said he had extraordinary capability for what he called patient thought. He could take a question and wrestle with it, and he would never tire of pursuing that question until he was satisfied with an answer. So whether that was with the mysteries of gravity or with the nature of light and how it could be separated into various colors, what would happen with antimony and different substances when you were trying to make Sophic mercury on your way to making the Philosopher's Stone. He just never tired of exploring these mysteries.
Yeah, and there's some suggestion, I think, in Newton's work that he was influenced by Sir George Ripley. So that Ripley Scroll that we mentioned earlier, that beautiful manuscript that's a sort of recipe for the Philosopher's Stone. Is that something that Newton would have been aware of? Could he have looked at that Ripley Scroll that you've got there? I mean, I think it must be really cool for you to hang around with, Newton's own handwriting and manuscripts full of all of his notes and his thoughts and all of that kind of stuff. That real tangible connection to the history is always fascinating to me. But is the Ripley Scroll something that Newton would have been familiar with, do you think?
Newton was certainly familiar with the Ripley Scroll and also with other writings of Ripley. Because Newton's favorite alchemist was this guy named Irenaeus Philalethes, peaceful lover of truth, who was the pseudonym of George Starkey, the individual who taught Robert Boyle alchemy. Absolutely, Newton was very familiar with Ripley. So Philalethes' favorite alchemist was Ripley. He wrote a book called Ripley Revived. He is really obsessed with Ripley, and Ripley has a particular approach to alchemy, which is rooted in various transformations made with antimony. And this antimonial approach to alchemy becomes a major part of Newton's alchemy. He's regularly reading Ripley. So we have a manuscript at the Huntingdon which shows these various roundels, little circles that are some kind of a representation of the making of the Philosopher's Stone. And they're associated with the humors of the body. So there's melancholy, and it's gendered. So there's feminine melancholy and masculine melancholy, all these different shades of the humors, and then also the elements. And this is a very similar thing to what we see in the Ripley Scroll, which at its top has these different spheres. Each one of them shows something strange happening within a flask. And alchemy tends to have a lot of strange allegory. And the images are often highly sexual. So you see these copulating individuals in flasks, which usually represents the bringing together of sulfur and mercury, and male elements and female elements to bring forth a child, either Sophic mercury or gold, or something like that. So certainly Newton was familiar with Ripley, familiar with the scroll, familiar with the imagery that was within it, and sought to decode imagery and the allegories and the symbols in alchemy in Ripley and in others.
I mean, it's pretty cool. It's not, hard to imagine that people were mastering these processes and seeing the outputs from them and wondering, how do you arrive at some sparkling subject by smashing a load of different elements together and putting them through a process. I guess it's not hard that they must have thought there was something magical, something going on in these processes that maybe they didn't understand in the way that we might understand them more scientifically today, I guess.
Chemistry, alchemy is a definite step on the way to modern chemistry. And I studied chemistry as an undergraduate, and it remains magical to me. The Philosopher's Stone is simply the idea that you can transform one thing into another thing. And that remains true. You can make many really extraordinary transformations in alchemy. And if anything, the universe has turned out to be weirder than alchemy thought. You can't really change lead into gold unless you have a particle accelerator and trillions of dollars. But quantum physics, quantum chemistry are utterly bizarre. So yeah, I don't really fault the alchemists for thinking that something like this was possible.
It's easy for us today to look back and think that this all sounds a bit, mystical and magical. But as you say, if it's a step that almost needed to take place for us to get to where we are with chemistry and physics today, then it's not silly, is it? It's an incredibly valuable scientific step forward, even if, it might look like it's something a bit more mystical or magical today.
Yeah, the relationship between alchemy and mysticism and magic is a very tricky one. I think a mistake that many have made, especially in the early 20th century, was assuming that alchemy was always mystical or magical. And for some, it certainly was. There were individuals like there's a guy named Heinrich Kuhnroth who certainly tied alchemy to mysticism, and he was into the Kabbalah and Hermeticism. So pulling from the body of works known as the Corpus Hermeticum of Hermes Trismegistus. So certainly he thought magic was associated with alchemy, but many didn't. And for many, the closest, spiritual side of alchemy was simply Christianity. Much alchemical imagery is just rooted in Christendom. So if you go back to 15th and 16th century visual representations of alchemy, you find a lot of religious symbolism. And to the question of how alchemy was a valuable scientific step forward, there's some particular ways that alchemy certainly moved our understanding of the natural world forward. So first, I work mostly in the 16th and 17th centuries, and in that period, we often talk about chemistry with two Y's. And historians like to use that term because it shows that it's the term that many people at the time would have used to describe what they were doing. And it's a time when alchemy was alchemical transmutation was slowly being divorced from other parts of chemistry. But that divorce didn't really take complete effect until late in the 18th century. So it was really throughout the 18th century that was occurring. Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, many others thought that alchemy was an important part of the study of the natural world. I work, again, mostly in the 16th and 17th centuries, and one area where we see a close tie between alchemy and other studies of the natural world is in atomism. Early conceptions that the universe was made up of tiny bits of matter, little particles. There were many alchemists who believed this. The guy that I work on is a German named Daniel Sennert, who had a proof of atomism from alchemy, where he would take silver, he would dissolve it in acid, and this was a real problem for other physicists at the time, because they didn't believe that individual particles had gone into solution. They thought that something entirely new had been created. Sennert would then precipitate the metal and pull it back out, put it in a furnace, and recover the original metal. He called this a reduction to the pristine state. There were others who were doing similar things like this, taking something, sometimes a compound, breaking it into its individual parts, and then putting it back together. So this idea that everything is made up of tiny particles and that the universe has these building blocks that can be taken apart and put back together. And Sennert has a really interesting passage of a work done in the, first half of the 17th century, where he says the only difference between, I think it's ether and alcohol, is the arrangement of the individual atoms. If you just change the arrangement of atoms, you arrive at totally different substances. My PhD advisor, Bill Newman, has a book called Atoms in Alchemy. But there are many other areas. There's a Belgian alchemist named Jan Baptist van Helmont who has ideas where he's clearly working with the conception of mass balance. The idea that the ingredients which go into a chemical reaction are what have to be in the products. And this is absolutely tied to his ideas as an alchemist. And he is a major alchemist. He also has a conception of a thing called an alkahest, which is a universal solvent. Big problem for the universal solvent. How do you put it in any container and keep it if it dissolves everything? But
a slight flaw in the existence of something like that, isn't there? Because it's surely going to be dissolving anything and everything it comes into contact with, so you can't store it in a jar or anything.
I'm sure if Helmont were around today, he would have an answer for that.
There's a couple of words that you've mentioned transmutation and things like that seem kind of technical terms within alchemy. Maybe are there other technical terms that we could be familiar with, the listeners could listen out to? And I'm also interested in how many of those might still be part of chemistry or physics today. Are they still words that we use in science?
Yeah, transmutation generally refers to taking one metal, usually it's a metal, changing it into another. More specifically, alchemists use terms from the Greek. There's crucipoia, which is gold making, argyropoia, silver making. I mean, you name it, there are technical terms. So, other terms that we still use in in chemistry today, balneum marii, Mary's bath, refers to a process where you have a water boiler and then you put another vessel on top of that in order to keep something at the boiling point of water. I mean, so I mentioned alchemy. There are other Greek terms, synkresis, the idea of synthesizing two things into one, diakresis, separating one thing into other things. Yeah, I mean, even distillation, standard throughout alchemy, remains an important part of chemistry today. Alchemists in the early modern period would have used a particular term from Paracelsus called spagyria. There's certain corners of the internet where you can find people talking about spagyric analysis. If I went through a checklist of chemical terms today, many of them would find a root in alchemy.
And what do we know about the kind of the etymology of the word alchemy itself? Where does that kind of originate from?
The word alchemy, like other words beginning in al, goes back to the Arabic world in the Middle Ages. So al is just the definite article in Arabic. It simply means the chemia. And chemia is a word that goes back to the Greeks. Alchemy has its roots in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. The first alchemist that we have writings of or record of as an individual named Zosimus of Panopolis. There are certainly people in the ancient world who are doing metallurgy and are interested in transformation. But the first serious combination of that kind of practical body of knowledge and then a theoretical body of knowledge is with Zosimus and individuals around that time period. So it really takes Greek philosophy, conceptions of what everything is made of. Is everything made up of multiple things, one thing? Some people believe everything is made up of just water. Other people believe that all sorts of different things come together to make up what we see. And yeah, this is combined with metallurgy, another ancient Greek individual who left a body of writings that have come to be known as the Four Books of Pseudo-Democritus. It has to do with all sorts of different types of transmutation and transformation. So alchemy in the ancient world wasn't just about transforming one metal into another. It was also about making purple. It was about other types of color transformations. It was about mimicking one color, the color of gold or something like that. So all sorts of different transformations. And it's really in Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, and the early modern period where the major focus turns to transmutation of metals. I suppose it's also in the Arabic Middle Ages with people like Jabir ibn Hayyan, in the Latin known as Geber. But there's another major work from an individual pretending to be Geber. This is a big problem throughout alchemy, is many authors are pretending to be someone from an earlier era. So there's actually a very influential author named Pseudo-Geber, or we call him Pseudo-Geber. He's likely a Franciscan monk from Italy, Paul of Taranto, who writes alchemical works, and one of them is called the Summa Perfectionis, the height of perfection. And It's a large body of practical alchemy and is all about transmutation. It has matter theory in it. From the Arabic world, we have the idea that everything is made up of this duality of sulfur and mercury. So going back to the ancient world, Aristotle, other Greeks believe everything is made up of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Even more fundamentally, they think the universe is made up of sensible principles, hot, cold, wet, and dry. With Geber, he believes everything is made up of sulfur and mercury. It seems to come from metallurgical processes involving cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide. Indeed, if you take it apart, you are left with sulfur and mercury, and these have different principles. So mercury is kind of cold and liquid, and sulfur is hot and dry. So this brings together certain elements of ancient philosophy and Aristotle and brings it into a chemical framework. And to make matters even more complicated, in the early modern era in the 16th century with Paracelsus adds salt to these 2 principles, and he calls salt, sulfur, and mercury the tria prima, the 3 first things, 3 principles, and he believes these are the foundational principles of nature. And this is a highly influential idea with early modern alchemists. And yeah, in both Aristotle and Paracelsus and others, you have these different principles which can be shifted and moved around, and amounts can be changed, and it changes the fundamental nature of what you have in front of you. So it certainly corresponds to ideas about transmutation. If all you need to do is to shift the amount of mercury in something and the amount of liquidity in order to make something fixed and solid, you can see how people might think that you could just add one thing to another and you can transform lead into a very fixed metal like gold.
It seems like alchemy's undergone that same kind of journey that lots of ancient texts did, lots of history and philosophy and medicine of moving from Greece and Egypt to the Arabic world, being worked on and translated and developed a bit there, and then sort of makes its way back to Europe. Kind of the 12th century, you get that kind of early Renaissance sort of period when all of those texts begin to flood back into Europe and begin to influence those thinkings. But it strikes me as you're speaking that in matters of alchemy, and alchemists seem much more open to changing ideas and developing notions than lots of other aspects of the medieval and early modern world, where all of those things are quite fixed, and it can be quite dangerous to challenge accepted ideas of the way the world works and the way the universe works, particularly when the church has such a hold on thought in Europe. It seems like alchemists were actually quite open to, maybe the world is this, maybe it's that, maybe there's several elements, maybe there's more, maybe there's less. They seem willing to debate all of those things that seem like closed books in many other aspects of the medieval world.
Really what separates alchemy from other types of natural philosophy, and I do think that's right, that alchemists, they are really open to new ideas. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that alchemy from its beginnings has been both a theoretical and a practical science, with an element always of laboratory work. Alchemists have always been messing around with things in furnaces and distilling things and roasting, just taking what they find and seeing, does it combine with other things? What happens when I take table salt and stick it over a campfire for long enough and collect the distillate? And it makes this extraordinary acid which burns my fingers and stings my nostrils, and it's hydrochloric acid, right? So you do see this in many different eras. And then also there are just particular personalities who are very iconoclastic and very willing to challenge the status quo and to challenge ancient ideas. I mean, there's no better representation of that than Paracelsus, who, his full name that I believe he gave to himself, Philippus Theophrastus Bombastus Aureolus von Hohenheim. I think he added the Bombastus. He's quite the character. So he's working in medical alchemy. He's looking for new substances which will heal the body. The received ideas in his day were recorded in Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, this major textbook, this big thing, hugely influential texts, the textbook for medicine in medieval universities. He publicly burns it. He says it's utter trash, it's garbage, only fit to be burned. We need new ideas, and some of these ideas are alchemical, rooted in his sulfur, mercury, and salt theory. He has lots of ideas about alchemical medicines and disease. He thinks all diseases are rooted in tartar, which is the substance that forms on the inside of wine barrels. He thinks the human body is very similar to that. He has all sorts of other ideas about disease and medicine, closely allied with very particular biblical theology. He's a fascinating guy. You know, it's important to note, sometimes alchemical ideas are against the church. You know, famously, there are multiple laws in the Middle Ages. You know, there's a papal bull against alchemy. In England, in the 15th century, there's a law forbidding the multiplication of metals. Alchemy is very controversial for the state, which, at this time is, closely allied with the church. The idea of multiplying metals is very controversial because, it would be horribly destabilizing for a currency. If you can take all the lead in a country and turn it into gold, you've effectively rendered gold worthless. It'll cause massive societal problems. So yeah, it's not until the late 17th century in England when these ideas are overturned and the laws are overturned through the efforts of Robert Boyle and others. At times, alchemy is controversial. There are various rulers who, have their alchemists. They put them into towers in their palaces and give them a pile of lead or iron and hope that they can turn it into gold. And certainly there have been individuals in the church who were allied with alchemists like that. But alchemy's official relationship to the church has been one that has changed from one period to another.
And Newton is alive and working around the same time, at the end of the 17th century, where chemistry is beginning to become a separate discipline, really, from alchemy. You've got Robert Boyle, who dies kind of 5 years before Assassin's Creed Gold is set. So as alchemy becomes separated from what we might recognize as the science of chemistry, does it cease to be of interest? Does it stop developing, or does it continue to have a reputation and have people working in the field of alchemy after that kind of separation of it from what we might recognize as genuine science?
Yeah, alchemy has a long life, even through the 18th century. There's a scholar at Johns Hopkins, Lawrence Principe, and he's done a study of the Académie Royale des Sciences in France, and has looked at multiple individuals who were a part of this Royal Academy and continued to be interested in transmutation well into the 18th century. At the same time, alchemy becomes, for various reasons, somewhat embarrassing, for whatever reason. It's mostly with the rise of scientific bureaucrats and the professionalism of science, there are individuals who really want to divorce transmutation from other aspects of chemistry. And they basically win the war within these official groups who get to tell you what counts as science and what doesn't count as science, or natural philosophy, as it would have been called. So Um, but the wedge had been driven even before then. The guy that I work on, Daniel Sennert, who's he believed in transmutation, but as someone in the 18th century put it, he put chemistry upon a firm foundation of natural philosophy. And there was an attempt to understand chemistry in terms of atomism. One of Sennert's students was a German named Werner Rolfink, which is a very fun name to say. Rolfink wrote a little treatise at the end of his major book on chemistry called Chemical Non-Entities. It's a book of skepticism, and he is skeptical of the Philosopher's Stone. He is skeptical of transmutation. He doesn't believe in this thing called the mercury of metals. So you have other people who take a truly skeptical approach to chemistry, do not believe these things unless it can be demonstrated by experiment, and they're also reluctant to believe the accounts of alchemists. So many alchemists, such as the guy that I work on, Daniel Sennert, would have believed in transmutation because it was held to be true by so many authorities. So many people had claimed that they had done these particular things and had transmuted base metals into gold. And there were also various experiments which made it look like they actually had performed a transmutation. Some of it's known to be just trickery now. If you take an alloy of gold and silver, and it looks to be relatively silver, you can drop that into particular acid, and it will come out and appear to be gold, and it seems like a transmutation has occurred. There are also various chemical displacement reactions, which, make it appear that you can stick an iron rod into a particular solution and it comes out and it's coated in, copper or another element. So, there are good reasons that alchemy was convincing for as long as it was. But yeah, late in the 17th century, a wedge is being driven that separates further in the 18th century, and you have new ideas about chemical affinities in the 17th and 18th century, which really form the research agenda for chemistry in the 18th century. But yeah, there was a traditional history of chemistry which made Robert Boyle the father of chemistry, which we now know to be really misguided. Boyle publishes an important book called The Skeptical Chemist, and he really wants to move chemistry away from the idea of these 5 principles. He wants to make it more mechanistic and to think of things in terms of atoms. He's heavily influenced by Daniel Sennert, but he is also a full-fledged alchemist. He is being taught transmutational alchemy by George Starkey. He's doing all sorts of other really things that do not comport with the conception of him as this scientific father figure of chemistry. Which is not to say that he is not important. He's hugely important in the history of chemistry. But I suppose any kind of patriarchal mythology about science usually needs to be complicated. And certainly the history of chemistry is one where we do need to look deeper. And I mean, the surprising thing about alchemy is it was long thought to be the domain of charlatans and fools. Boyle was thought to be the person who, really overturned alchemy and moved it towards chemistry. But I think you dig deeper, and what you find is alchemy was very rational, and it was very practical. It's one area where you see this joining of a body of theory and practice, and people are doing interesting things in the laboratory in the Middle Ages, and it's this growing body of knowledge which continues up and really has an important influence on the rise of chemistry.
For someone like Isaac Newton, do you think that he genuinely believed that you could make a philosopher's stone, that it was something that he could make, or was it the process of trying to do it and the things you might learn through that process that was of interest to him, or was it a bit of both?
I think it's certainly both things, that Newton did believe that transmutation was possible, and he would have based that on many authorities. But certainly also that there were certain things you learned along the way about the nature of matter. I don't think Newton's interest in finding the Philosopher's Stone was rooted in a desire to become wealthy. Newton was already wealthy. No, Newton wasn't invested in alchemy for the purposes of becoming wealthy. It was really to understand the laws of nature, to understand how nature of matter was orderly, similar to the way that gravity behaved, or white light. I think that the example of optics is a good one. When Newton separates white into its various colors and then recombines them, so he sets up really extraordinary experiment. Takes one prism, separates white light into its different colors, uses another prism to recombine them. He actually uses a chemical term to describe this. He uses the Latin redintegration, which is a term borrowed from earlier 17th century alchemists who thought that you could redintegrate things like vitriol. So copper sulfate. A chemist named Angelo Sala, who has a book on the anatomy of vitriol, and he uses the word redintegrate. You can take copper sulfate or iron sulfate, take them apart into the building blocks that he thinks that they're composed of. You can recombine them to get the original materials. So when Newton is searching for a term to describe what's happening with light, he borrows from this chemical term. And I think that is one of the few areas where it's really clear that Newton's ideas in physics are overlapping with his ideas in alchemy. There have been a lot of theories from historians over the years trying to make sense of Newton's alchemy. How does it go along with his ideas in physics and mathematics? And that's one area where it's very clear that there's overlap between the two.
I mean, surrounded by all of these texts and working as you do with all of these recipes to achieve incredible things, have you ever tried any of the recipes? Have you ever tried any alchemy in a lab?
Have I ever tried alchemy in a lab? Am I an aspiring adept, an aspiring alchemist? Yeah, we on the Chemistry of Isaac Newton project, we have attempted various things that we know Newton did, and we haven't made any gold yet, but we have performed various things that Newton did. So, for instance, Newton had this idea of what he called the vegetability of metals, the notion that metals grow in the earth and are similar to a tree, a plant. They're similar to vegetable things that grow. And he had a couple things that he had borrowed from others to demonstrate that this principle was true. One particular thing that Newton tried in the lab, he called the tree of Diana. And you combine various things, including mercury, and what you see in a little flask through clear liquid is a little, ball of metal, and then it slowly grows before your eyes. And it happens quick enough that you can sit there for an hour and you see it actually growing. Another experiment was borrowed from a German chemist, alchemist named Johann Rudolf Glauber. And Glauber has an experiment which we would know today as a chemical garden or a silica garden, where you take a saturated solution of sodium or potassium silicate and you put transitional metal salts into it, and you literally watch these little things grow. Beautiful colors and these little tubes which form right before your eyes. Newton and others were convinced by seeing this that metals could grow. Also from looking at various mines and caves and seeing stalactites and such, they believed that minerals and metals could grow. So there's certainly a logic to this, and yeah, working in the laboratory, we've made various things to try and understand what Newton was doing, and yeah, this is something that isn't unique to alchemy. There are other areas where people have been going into the lab today to try to understand history. I worked for a project at Columbia University for 3 years on a postdoc called the Making and Knowing Project, where we were reconstructing recipes and entries from a Middle French 16th century book of secrets, just to try and make sense of what was happening. And it's a long and laborious thing to do, but working in the laboratory gives you insights into these things that really aren't available simply from working from texts. It often helps to be able to really slow down the process, see what's happening, and sometimes you come up with useful information. Often, much like other laboratory work, you're entirely confused and you do not understand what's happening.
But it must be great fun and a real practical way to explore the history that, as you say, is otherwise just written in a manuscript in front of you. You can get your hands dirty and get into it. This has been absolutely wonderful. I've been fascinated by this kind of history of alchemy and the ways in which it's influenced people and opinions and the development of science, and this position of it as almost a stepping stone on the way to more modern ideas of science. Before we finish, I always offer my guests the opportunity to step into the Assassin's Creed Animus and travel back into the past. So if you could visit any moment from the history of alchemy, or perhaps sit down for a drink with any person from the history of alchemy and ask them a few questions, what would you like to see, or who would you like to meet?
Much like Assassin's Creed Gold, I would want to visit Newton. I can't think of a better individual to go back and follow some historical memories from that didn't make it into the official historical record. So in addition to learning about the alchemical pursuits, there's a lot that I want to know about Newton's time at the Mint. At the Huntingdon, we have several documents written on parchment from Newton's time at the Mint, which are, one is an official summons for an individual accused of coin clipping, and another for an individual accused of counterfeiting. And I'd really like to learn more about how Newton's work at the Mint, how that went along with his interest in alchemy, and likewise, he did publicly comment on losing a large amount of money in the South Sea stock bubble. But I think it'd be interesting to grill him on a number of these things, both alchemy and the Mint, and I mean all of his other several hundred pursuits.
A few pints down the pub with Isaac Newton sounds like a good way to spend an evening. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Joel. It's been incredible to learn far more than I ever knew about all of these different aspects of alchemy, of the Philosopher's Stone, and of Isaac Newton's interest in them. So thank you very, very much for joining us and sharing all of your expertise.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me as we explored the real history that's inspired Assassin's Creed. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and share it with your friends, and subscribe to keep up with the latest episodes of Echoes of History.